she had been expecting him for 11 days. That is what I want you to understand first, before anything else. Not that she was afraid of him, not that she had been counting the days in dread. She had been counting them the way a farmer counts the approach of a storm, with clear eyes, and the particular calm of someone who has already made every preparation that can be made, and knows the rest is not in her hands. Miss Rowena Croft knew what the Earl of Hadley was coming to do. She had known since the letter arrived in early November. Official, brief, the kind of letter written by a man who does not expect to need more than one, informing her that his lordship would be arriving to assess the property of Marlowe Park with a view to its disposal. Disposal, that was the word he used, the same word you'd use for a broken piece of furniture. She had read it twice. Then she had folded it very precisely along its original creases and placed it in the top drawer of the desk that had been her father's, in the study that had been his before that. In the house she had not left except to cross the grounds, to check the tenants, to review the harvest records, to walk the fields at first light the way her father had walked them and his father before him. For 3 years now. 3 years since Mr. Edward Croft, steward of Marlowe Park for 31 years, had died between one breath and the next on a Tuesday morning in March, and his daughter had sat with his accounts for 4 days straight and decided that she was not going to let everything he had built come quietly apart. So she had not announced his death to the estate office in London. She had simply continued signing his correspondence. E. Croft, estate steward, and managing the tenants, and sending the quarterly reports, and keeping 3 years of meticulous ledgers that the Earl of Hadley had apparently never found occasion to read. Now he was coming, and Miss Croft had 11 days to decide what to do about that. What she decided in the end was to do nothing differently. She would continue to do what she had been doing. The estate would speak for itself, or it would not. She was 30 years old and had been managing 2,000 acres and a household staff, and the livelihoods of 43 tenant families since she was 27, and she was not going to arrange her face into an expression of apology for any of it. I am going to stop here for a moment, dear friends, and ask you something. Have you ever met someone who had more competence in her smallest gesture than most people display in a lifetime of effort? Someone whose stillness was not emptiness but fullness. The specific fullness of a person who has done the work and knows it, and has no interest in performing the knowing. If you have, then you already understand something about Miss Croft before I tell you another word. And if you have not, well, stay with me. She is coming. If you are new here, this is Moonlight at Marlowe, the place where I bring you stories about quiet courage and the remarkable people who find each other in the places no one else thinks to look. So the next story finds you. And if you have been here before, you know exactly what that means. Welcome back. The Earl of Hadley arrived on a Wednesday morning in mid-November, which was about the worst possible time to see Marlowe Park at its best, a fact that Miss Croft had noted and found appropriate. Let him see it in November. Let him see it grey and cold and stripped bare, the way everything is stripped bare in November, and see whether what remained was worth seeing. He was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to articulate exactly what she had expected. The letters from London had been written in the hand of a secretary, formal and bloodless, and she had constructed from them a certain kind of man. Large, probably, in the manner of men who are accustomed to filling rooms through title rather than presence, soft around the middle from town living, distracted, in the particular way of men who have inherited more than they have earned. Lord Piers Cavendish, Earl of Hadley, was none of those things. He was lean in the way of a man who moved with purpose rather than occasion, dark-haired, somewhere between 35 and 40. He stepped out of the carriage before his man could open the door, which told her something. He looked at the house. Not the way visitors looked at it, cataloguing its grandeur, but the way someone looks at a problem they have not yet solved. That told her something else. His first words, addressed to the man beside him, and not to her, were, "The east wing roof has been repaired." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He turned. He had not until that moment looked at her directly. He did so now, and she met his gaze without accommodation, the way she met every gaze, and watched him revise something behind his eyes. "Miss Croft," he said. "My lord. I was expecting your father." There was a pause the length of a held breath. She had known this moment would come. She had known it and prepared for it, and stood in it now with both feet flat on the ground and her hands quiet at her sides. "My father died 3 years ago," she said. "In March, I am the one who has been managing the estate." The silence that followed was a specific kind. Not the silence of a man who is angry. The silence of a man who is recalculating. "You have been sending the quarterly reports." "Yes." "Signing them." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, though she made no effort to make it comfortable. Then he said, "I would like to see the accounts." "Of course," she said. "They are in the study. I will show you." She did not wait for agreement. She simply turned toward the house, and after a brief hesitation, that she heard rather than saw, the slight adjustment of his footfall as he decided to follow, he came. The accounts were in the study, as she had said. 3 years of them, organized by quarter, cross-referenced by tenant, annotated in her small, precise hand with the kind of detail that went beyond what any estate office in London would have thought to ask for. Projected yields, actual yields, variance, reason for variance, corrective measure taken, outcome of corrective measure. 3 years of a woman managing 43 families' livelihoods, in a language that looked like numbers, but was actually something closer to care. She placed the first ledger on the desk in front of him and stood back. He sat down. He did not speak. He opened the ledger and began to read. This was how she learned something about the Earl of Hadley that his letters had not conveyed. When he was actually reading something, he was very still. Not the stillness of disengagement. The stillness of a man whose intelligence was fully occupied. She had expected this to take 20 minutes. It took 2 hours. At the end of the 2nd hour, he closed the 3rd ledger and sat with his hands flat on its cover. The study was warm. She had kept the fire properly attended, as she kept everything properly attended, and the room held the particular quality of warmth that is not about temperature, but about habit, the warmth of a room that has been lived in. "The Brennan tenancy," he said, "in the spring of last year. Flood damage to the southern field," she said. "I reduced their quarter's rent by 1/3, and arranged for the seed stock from the northern barn. That wasn't authorized by the estate office." "No," she said, "but it was correct. The Brennans have been on this land for 4 generations. A season's loss of income would have been recoverable. A season's loss of the Brennans would not." He looked at her. "How many decisions of this nature have you made without authorization?" he said. "As many as were necessary," she said. "I have documented all of them." "I see that," he paused, "the east wing roof. There was a structural survey in February. I had the choice of repairing it immediately or waiting for authorization and losing the interior to water damage. I chose to repair it. The cost came from the reserve fund." "Yes," which is now replenished, as you can see from the current quarter's summary. He looked at the ledger again, then at her. Then he said, in the manner of a man who has encountered a fact that requires revision of several prior assumptions, "You have been running this estate entirely on your own for 3 years." "Yes." "With no authorization." "With the authority that the situation required," she said, "which is different from authorization, I understand. But the distinction becomes less interesting when there are 43 families depending on the harvest being managed correctly. This was the moment, if I am being honest with you. This was the moment when it could have gone either way." He was a man of title, accustomed to order and the proper channels of order. She had operated outside every proper channel available. He could have, and some men would have, reduced the conversation to a matter of procedure. Thanked her for her service, compensated her appropriately, and closed Marlowe Park exactly as he had intended. But something held him, and I have thought about this a great deal. I think what held him was the ledgers themselves. Not the numbers. The character of the numbers. The specific handwriting of a person who pays attention, who corrects her own errors in the margin and notes why they were made, who wrote in the accounting for a flooded field, not tenant loss but Brennan family, Southfield, flood, 4 children, corrective measure, C attached. The C attached being a single sheet of careful notes about the family, their history on the land, the names of the children. He sat in the study of Marlowe Park on a cold Wednesday in November, and held a ledger that had the names of children in it, and he was quiet for a long time. "You intended to continue this indefinitely," he said. "I intended to continue until someone responsible made a different decision," she said. "You are here now, that is someone responsible. You could have written to inform me of your father's death." "I could have," she said. "And the estate office would have sent a replacement steward inside of a month, while everything we had built here fell to a stranger to learn. The Brennan flood would have happened anyway. The roof would have gone unreported in the transition. 3 years of relationships and knowledge, and earned trust with 43 families. None of that transfers in a letter." She paused. Then, because she had decided in 11 days of waiting that honesty was the only strategy available to her that she could live with afterward, she said, "You came here to close a grave, but nothing here is dead. Walk the estate with me tomorrow morning and see for yourself before you decide anything." He looked at her for a long moment. "That is a very direct thing to say to an earl," he said. "Yes," she said, "I expect it is." He did not smile. But something shifted at the edges of his expression. Something that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it, the way a landscape is adjacent to a change in weather before the change actually arrives. 7 o'clock, he said. "I am always up at 6, she said, "but 7 is acceptable." She showed him to the guest rooms. She had prepared them herself, with Maron from the village and old Mr. Phelps, who did the heavier work, because she had let the house staff reduce over 3 years as people left for better-paying positions in town, and she had not replaced them. Every pound she saved went back into the estate fund. He did not comment on the reduced staff. She noticed that he did not comment, which told her something further. That night she sat in the kitchen, the only room she actually heated after dark to save on coal, and wrote in the margins of her own notes, "He reads carefully. He listened. He said 7 o'clock. These were small things. She had learned to find the weight in small things. He was at the door at 6:50. She handed him a coat. Her father's coat, which she kept in the hall because it fit no one she knew and she had never been able to bring herself to part with it. And he put it on without comment, and they went out into the November morning. I want to tell you what they saw, because the seeing matters. The fields were properly turned for the winter. The tenant cottages along the eastern boundary had new thatch. She had organized that in September, 3 roofs in a fortnight. The drainage channels that had caused problems for years along the low ground had been recut last summer, a project that had taken 6 weeks and cost more than she'd wanted to spend, and had prevented the kind of flooding that had cost the Brennans so dearly the year before. The woodlot had been properly coppiced. The fences were sound. A farm does not look heroic in November. It looks exactly like what it is, maintained, tended, prepared for the season that is coming rather than the one that just passed. He walked, and she walked beside him, and she told him what she saw the same way she would have told her father. Matter-of-factly, with the specific names of the people who had done the work, because the work was not hers alone, and she had never thought of it as hers alone. "The drainage project," he said at the low ground. "That was not in the summary reports." "It is in the supplementary file," she said. Under infrastructure, with the cost breakdown and the 3-year projected savings against flood loss. He looked at the channels for a moment. Then he said, without preamble, "Why didn't you leave?" She said, "I beg your pardon. After your father died, you could have left. You are clearly capable of finding employment elsewhere. Why did you stay and take on work that wasn't yours and that you had no reason to expect would ever be acknowledged?" She was quiet for a moment. They were standing at the edge of the low field, and the November light was thin and pale, and the smell of turned earth was in the air, and she thought about how to answer this. She thought about all the careful, strategic answers available to her. The pragmatic ones, the ones that would make her sound sensible rather than, whatever, the true answer made her sound. She gave him the true answer. "Because I know the names of the children," she said. He said nothing. "I know that the eldest Brennan boy is 17 and wants to apprentice in town, but is staying because his father's back is giving out, and the harvest still needs managing. I know that Mrs. Talbot in the North Cottage has been covering her own roof repairs out of her savings because she was afraid to ask for help after how the last steward handled her complaint. I know that the old orchard on the western boundary is dying and could be saved with the right rootstock and 2 seasons of work, and that it was planted by a man named Croft, who was my great-grandfather and who is buried in the churchyard a 1/4 mile from here." She paused. "I stayed because leaving would have meant that all of that knowledge simply stopped, and everything it connected to would have frayed quietly apart, and no one in London would have noticed until it was too late to matter." He turned to look at her. She met his gaze the way she always did, with both feet flat on the ground and nothing concealed, and waited. "That is not a practical reason," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked back at the field. He stood there for a long moment, and she let him stand there, because she had learned that some silences needed to be occupied rather than filled. Then he said, very quietly, "And this is the thing I want you to carry with you, dear friends. When this story is over," he said, "my father died without ever having set foot on this land. He inherited it and never came. He left it to me with the same indifference, and I carried that same indifference until 3 weeks ago when the London office said it was costing more than it earned and should be sold." He paused. The London office was working from the summary reports, not from the accounts. "They never asked for the accounts," she said. "No," he said, "they didn't." There was a long silence. A crow crossed the pale sky overhead, and the turned earth smelled of cold and coming frost, and at the edge of the woodlot a rabbit sat still and watched them with the complete calm of a creature who has no stake in human decisions. He said, "How long would it take to bring the orchard back?" She said, 2 seasons, possibly 3. He said, "You mentioned the rootstock. Where would you source it?" "There is a nursery in Yorkshire I have been corresponding with," she said. "Mr. Aldous keeps heritage varieties. He has the original stock. I traced it through counting records." She paused. "I wrote to him last spring, provisionally." "Provisionally," he said. "I didn't know if the estate would still exist in 2 seasons," she said. "I was being realistic." He turned back toward the house then, and she fell into step beside him. And they walked in the particular silence of 2 people who have said a great deal and are not yet certain what to do with what has been said. At the garden gate, the iron gate that led back from the fields to the house grounds, that she had oiled in October because the hinge had been sticking, he stopped. He said, "I will need to remain for several more days." "The guest rooms are prepared," she said. "I will need to review the infrastructure supplementary file." "It is on the desk in the study," she said, "next to the orchard correspondence." He looked at the gate, then at her. There was something in his expression that was new, or not new perhaps, but closer to the surface than it had been the day before. Something that was not quite the way he had looked at the ledgers, which was assessment. Something that was different from assessment. He said, "Miss Croft." My lord. I came here to end something. I am aware that I nearly did so without reading the accounts. Yes, she said. He stopped. He was finding the right word, and she could see him finding it, and she let him find it. Careless, he said. It was careless. She said, it was what the summary reports supported. The summary reports did not have the names of the children in them. No, she said, they didn't. He opened the gate. The hinge moved quietly on its oiled joint. 7 o'clock tomorrow, he said. I will be ready at 6, she said, but 7 is acceptable. This time he did smile. It was brief and it changed his face considerably, and she filed it away with the same precise attention she gave to everything. The orchard correspondence, the tenant notes, the particular quality of a silence in a man who has revised his assumptions and has not yet decided where to put the revision. He stayed for 6 days. I will not tell you everything that happened in those 6 days, because some of it belonged to them, and the cold fields, and the low grey light of a November that is preparing for winter and has no interest in performing warmth for an audience. But I will tell you what I know. I know that on the 3rd day he went to the churchyard and found the grave of the man who had planted the original orchard, and stood there for a while in the way a person stands at the grave of someone they did not know, but have come to understand through their work. I know this because she did not go with him. She had her own work that morning, and he came back quieter than he had left. And over dinner that evening he asked her to tell him about her father, and she did, and the telling took the better part of the evening, and when she stopped, he asked a question that meant he had been listening closely. And she answered it, and the fire went low in the grate, and neither of them rose to attend it. I know that on the 5th day, a letter went to the estate office in London, informing them that the disposal of Marlowe Park was to be indefinitely suspended, pending a full review of the accounts. The real accounts, all 3 years of them, which were to be forwarded to his personal office, and not the general estate administration. I know that on the morning of the 6th day, when the carriage came round, and Mr. Phelps brought his bags down, Lord Hadley stood in the drive and said, I will write to the Yorkshire nursery myself. The authorization will be unambiguous. She said, the timing matters for the rootstock, spring shipping. I will attend to it before the new year, he said. A pause. The November morning was very still. Somewhere across the grounds, one of the tenant children was calling for a dog, the name carried on the air and then gone. He said, You should have been formally appointed 3 years ago. She said, Yes. There will be a letter from the estate office, he said, setting out the title and the compensation. She said, the compensation should reflect 3 years. It will, he said. And the particular evenness of his tone when he said it told her that he had already worked this out, and she was not going to have to argue for it. She had not expected to not have to argue for it. She said, Thank you, my lord. He said, Thank you, Miss Croft, for the accounts, for the tenants, for all of it. She said, The estate is worth preserving. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, the way he had said the thing about being careless, Yes, it is. He got into the carriage. The drive crunched under the wheels. She stood at the edge of the gravel and watched it go, and when it turned at the bottom of the lanes and was out of sight, she stood there a moment longer in the cold morning air, and then she went inside. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the tea and the morning quiet. After a while, she took out the letter she had received 11 days ago, the one about disposal, and she looked at it for a long moment. Then she put it in the fire. Now, dear friends, I have told you a story about a woman who kept an estate alive for 3 years without credit, and a man who came to close it down and chose at the last to open it instead. I have told you about accounts with children's names in them, and a gate that swung quietly on an oiled hinge, and a grave in a churchyard that a man visited on the 3rd day of a 6-day stay. What I have not told you, because it is not mine to tell, is what the letters between them contained in the 3 months that followed. I know only that there were letters, that they were sent to the main house address and not the estate office, that the rootstock from Yorkshire arrived in April on schedule, and that on the morning it was planted. 3 men from the eastern tenancies and 1 woman who knew exactly how deep the hole needed to be. The Earl of Hadley's carriage came up the lane again. She was already in the orchard when it arrived. She looked up from her work and saw him crossing the field toward her, and she did not change her expression or her posture or the careful angle of the planting stake in her hand. He came and stood at the edge of the prepared ground and looked at what she had laid out. He said, "You started without me." She said, "You're 3 hours late." He said, "I had a letter to send." "To the estate office." "No," he said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope and held it out. "To you." She looked at it, then at him. Then she set down the stake and took the envelope, and she opened it there in the cold spring orchard, with the smell of turned earth rising around her, and the Yorkshire rootstock standing in its buckets, and the Brennan boy watching from a respectful distance. And she read what he had written. I am not going to tell you what the letter said, but I will tell you this. She read it twice. The second time she was very still. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases, the way she did with everything she intended to keep, and she put it in her coat pocket, and she picked up the planting stake, and she said, "Well, since you're here, you can help." And he did. That is the end of this story. But it is not the end of Marlowe Park, nor of the woman who understood before anyone else did that there is no such thing as an estate. Only the people on it, and the work they do, and the names they carry with them, and the care, the specific unglamorous daily unacknowledged care, that keeps any living thing from coming quietly apart. Some things are worth preserving. She knew that. Eventually, so did he. That is always how it works. If you are patient enough to wait for the right person to come and actually read the accounts. Subscribe to Moonlight at Marlowe, dear friends. Come back to the fire. There is always another story here, and I will be waiting.